What is the difference between a technical designer and a gameplay engineer? Okay, that is the question which I was asked by a friend of mine on Twitter, anonymous remaining, and I have a few thoughts on this question, and it's a common question, but it's kind of a difficult one to answer because it does depend on the studio we're talking about. But I'm going to do my best to sort of break it down the way I normally do, and hopefully present to you something that will give you a little bit of better idea for where you might stand if you're interested in one of these roles. So here was the question, and essentially he wanted to know the difference between gameplay engineer, gameplay programming, and technical design. Now, gameplay engineer and gameplay programmer, it's safe to say, are pretty much the same exact thing. When they say programmer or engineer, those terms are interchangeable. In non-gaming or game development, you might also hear the term software developer. That is very uncommon in the games industry, but if you hear like yeah, you probably won't hear that. You're probably going to either hear engineer or programmer. The terms are interchangeable. There's some other like notifications like that. Like you might hear the term architect. That also means programmer, but it's a special role within programming. If someone's like an architect, then that usually means they're like very experienced at like almost a director level, but they don't have subordinates. Usually that's what it means. Like if you're maybe an engineer, and then you could become like a lead engineer or like a senior engineer or something like that. And then if you want to keep being a people manager, you might be able to go from being a lead to like a director or something like that. Or if you want to stay just being solo, an independent contributor, then you might go from being like senior to like senior staff to maybe a architect. And you know, we could talk about that later, but really the distinction we're talking about today is just the difference between an engineer and a designer. And basically a gameplay programmer is very firmly in the engineering section, where a technical designer is firmly in the design section. Both of them sort of on the border of crossing into the other section. And just to visualize that, here's a rough diagram where we have three sort of the three of what they would call the four horsemen of game development. The fourth being marketing, which is probably more important than any one of these alone, but it's omitted because it's not here. And then of course there's also production, and you know, QA probably falls slightly within code. And there's, you know, the executive team and all that stuff. But here's just a rough idea of just the three content creators, I would say. Or, you know, you might say content creators aren't design. But here's three sections. And when we talk about gameplay programmer and technical designer, they fall in those respective slots. So up here on the edge of becoming a coder, but still in the design section, is a technical designer. Just the opposite of true as a gameplay programmer. So what that means basically is if you're a gameplay programmer, your coworkers, the people you're probably sitting next to, unless it's split up per like strike team, is going to be other engineers. If you're a gameplay programmer, you're going to be hanging out, working beside, helping out fellow gameplay engineers, other engineers, right? Other coders, maybe a tools engineer, a UI engineer. Those are all things that might fall into sort of your friends and buddies. But if you're a technical designer, then you're probably going to be working more closely with level designers, character designers, stuff like that, quest designers, certainly. So that's sort of the difference. It's either you're in this section or you're in that section. But, of course, there's a lot of crosstalk and collaboration between the two. And what's interesting about this is that a tech designer, the reason why they're on the cusp here is because a tech designer will often do a little bit of coding. And so that's what the technical part comes from, right? So in art, we actually have the same thing where there's a technical artist role. And so technical artist often connotes rigging, and maybe having a role in some of the tool set that goes into exporting like 3D geometry from something like Maya to like a proprietary game engine. However, that's not always necessarily coding. It's usually more towards like rigging and stuff like that. However, with a technical designer, you should be expected to code. However, when we say code, we're really talking about scripting. And so it's a minor nuance, but the difference between programming and scripting at some studios is not that much, and at other studios that is a big difference, whether or not you're a scripter or a coder. And I won't go too deep into the differences now, but it could be completely different languages, right? So probably the most common coding language in gameplay engineering is going to be C++, and then the most common scripting language is probably going to be something like Lua, Or if you're working in like Unreal Engine, you might even have a visual scripting editor. So something like Blueprints is very close to what you would see for something like that. So a technical designer might be doing blueprinting. It's very unlikely that a gameplay engineer is going to be working with blueprints. They might need to jump in there to debug something for their fellow designers, but it's unlikely that they're going to start their workday implementing stuff in a blueprint. That's unlikely. So here's another way to look at it, just a few high-level notes here. A gameplay engineer is someone who's going to be sort of creating the tools, and then a tech designer is going to be taking those tools and actually creating the levels or the content that the user is going to see. It's usually the case that the gameplay engineer is not directly creating the stuff that's for the player. Instead, they're creating the stuff that is for the tech designer, who will then create the stuff that's for the player. Usually, the design is sort of a layer between there. Often it's the case that the gameplay engineer is going to be exposing values that the tech designer can then tune, right? So this is a very common relationship between these two contributors, where you might have, let's say, the combat system where you can tune the speed of the attack. And so the gameplay engineer, maybe they're dealing with some animation code, they can expose a float value, which is attack speed. And then it's probably a designer who's going to be manually tuning the attack speed to, whatever the different attack needs to be and stuff like that. If they're creating blend shapes for, what is going to be the collision volume for this attack to register hit detection and stuff like that, that could, if it gets a little bit technical, fall into the role of a tech designer. But basically a gameplay engineer's role is usually to do it once and then have the tech designer kind of do it again and again and again. For each, bespoke requirement. For that reason, a gameplay engineers, usually there's not a lot of engineers compared to designers on a project. I think I've heard it's something like 1 to 3, where you might have one engineer for every 3 people who are either an artist or a designer. So there's way less engineers. And so that's usually because they try to make their work often scales a lot better, right? So they're probably making the tools. You don't need, a ton of tools, but you're going to need a lot of people using those tools to make the actual content for the game. So for that reason, there's usually less engineers than designers. So that's another note. We talked about coding versus scripting. The other note here is that, yes, there's less gameplay engineers. They're typically a little bit harder to hire because, the people with those skills could very easily probably get a job in another software engineering career, non-gaming related. And so because of that, they do get paid a little bit higher. So I grabbed these approximate salaries from the game company Riot Games, right? They make games like League of Legends and Legends of Runeterra, some of my favorite game right now on mobile. However, these numbers are certainly a little bit higher than you would expect on average, right? Because that company is making some big money. However, I think this relationship between the two is sort of a hint in the right direction. So typically a gameplay engineer is going to make more than a tech designer. Is it always going to be 50K more or twice as much? I don't think so. I think they're probably going to be a little bit closer together. However, you should expect a pretty sizable difference. $10,000? Yes, quite easily, between the difference between a gameplay engineer's income and a tech designer's income. And again, that is a bunch of factors, but one of them is there's less gameplay engineers who are going to be needed for a team. And it's also probably the case that it's going to be a little bit harder to hire them because they are probably going to be able to field options from adjacent fields a little bit easier than a tech designer would. Because again, the tech designer is planted within that design section, whereas a gameplay engineer at the end of the day really is a coder. The gameplay, note there is just saying what they're coding for any given time. So with that being said, that is the distinction. I hope it helps you out. If you have any questions, just drop them in the comment section. I'd be happy to go into further detail or cite some examples if you'd like. And if you're finding your way to choose between the two, I would say it never hurts to try tasks of both. When I tried to be an intern at the God of War studio, I was not really sure. Do I want to be a tech designer? Do I want to be a gameplay engineer? I tried to take on tasks that were a little bit related to both, and I think I found out that I really did enjoy the gameplay engineering a lot more. And I think with a lot of these things, if you try it, you'll be able to really experience it for yourself and figure out which one resonates more with you. Again, it is a big distinction with respect to if you're making stuff for the player or if you're making things that will be used to make stuff for the player, right? Usually making tools, if it's a tools engineer, or maybe creating parameters, stuff like that. So I think that's all I have to say about that. Good luck on the interviews. Like, share, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.